The pay is decent and the benefits are good. The market is already dominated by big companies. There is no point in competing. I just want to clock out at 5 and pay my mortgage. Listen to the pathetic, domesticated language of the modern corporate slave. You have successfully traded your absolute sovereignty for a comfortable, air-conditioned cage. You wake up every single morning, drain your physical energy, and sacrifice the best years of your youth to build an empire that belongs to someone else. You are given a meaningless middle management title, a steady paycheck, and a few weeks of vacation, and you immediately surrender your ambition. You have convinced yourself that this is safety. It is not safety. It is a slow, quiet death. You can hear this surrender in the specific language people reach for when defending it, not, "I chose this consciously and find it meaningful," which would be an honest statement about values. But the pay is decent, which is the language of someone who has quietly stopped measuring themselves against what they wanted and started measuring themselves against what they managed to keep. Decent is not a word that describes satisfaction. It is a word that describes the minimum above which complaint becomes socially difficult. A man who has genuinely chosen his life does not describe it as decent. A man who has made peace with settling describes it as decent and calls the peace wisdom when it is closer to surrender. When massive conglomerates dominate your industry, you do not look for a way to destroy them. You update your resume and beg them for a job. You negotiate for crumbs off the master's table, entirely content to live your entire life as a highly replaceable pawn on a chessboard you will never control. We must travel to the dense, volcanic jungles of 17th century Java to understand the absolute disgrace of a man without sovereignty. We must look at a time when the world's very first and most terrifying capitalist megacorporation arrived to swallow an entire archipelago, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The VOC was not just a business. It was a merciless, heavily armed, global monopoly with its own massive military force. To understand how overwhelming its advantage was, consider that the VOC at its height had a larger fleet than most sovereign nations, its own standing army, the legal authority to wage war and sign treaties on behalf of the Dutch Republic, and capital reserves that allowed it to sustain military operations for years without a single profitable quarter needing to intervene. It was not a company competing in a market. It was a state, disguised as a company, with all the violence a state is permitted to use, and none of the obligations a state is expected to bear toward the people under its authority. When they anchored their warships off the coast of Java and built their towering fortress in Batavia, the regional leaders and petty kings did exactly what you do today. They compromised. They saw the impossible wealth and the advanced cannons of the VOC, and they completely abandoned their pride. They signed treaties, accepted bribes, and gladly became wealthy puppets, managing the land for their foreign bosses. They chose the safety of a guaranteed income over the danger of freedom. The accommodation looked entirely rational from inside the decision. The kings who signed those treaties were not stupid men. They were pragmatic men operating on a calculation that, from a short-term perspective, was mathematically correct. The VOC was stronger, the cost of resistance was high, and cooperation delivered real and immediate benefits. What they failed to account for is that the treaties they signed as temporary arrangements became permanent frameworks, that the wealth they received as compensation became dependency, and that a generation later, their grandchildren were administering Dutch commercial interests rather than ruling their own people, not because anyone had overtly stripped their sovereignty, but because the accommodation had been so gradual and so comfortable that the sovereignty had dissolved without anyone noticing the moment it became irreversible. This is the mechanism of every soft conquest, whether it happens to a kingdom or to a life. The first accommodation is survivable and reasonable. By the time the pattern is visible as a pattern, reversing it costs more than it would have cost to resist it at the beginning, and the people inside the pattern have by then organized their entire identity around the narrative that the accommodation was a choice rather than a surrender. But there was one ruler who looked at this invincible corporate giant and felt nothing but absolute boiling disgust. He was the supreme ruler of the Mataram Sultanate. His name was Sultan Agung. Sultan Agung did not care about the VOC's unlimited capital. He did not care that they had better technology, stronger walls, and a global supply chain. To him, the very presence of a foreign monopoly dictating the terms of trade in his domain was an unforgivable insult. Sovereignty was not a negotiation. It was an absolute mandate. Sultan Agung refused to be a tenant in his own homeland, and he utterly refused to become a middleman for a greedy corporation. His position was not the equal of the VOCs by any conventional measure of military power. Mataram was a powerful Javanese sultanate, but the gap in naval capability alone was enormous, and the VOC's fortress at Batavia had been designed and constructed by engineers specifically to resist prolonged siege. Every military advisor with a realistic assessment of the situation would have counseled exactly what the other regional kings counseled themselves: negotiate, accommodate, and preserve what can be preserved. Sultan Agung's refusal was not born from a miscalculation of the odds. It was born from a prior decision that some terms were simply not acceptable, regardless of the odds, and that a life lived under the VOC's commercial dominion was a life he was not willing to live, even if the alternative was far more painful and far less certain. While the other kings were happily bending the knee for a steady flow of gold, Sultan Agung made a decision that defied all logic. He did not ask for a seat at the table. He declared total, uncompromising war. He ordered the mobilization of tens of thousands of warriors from the deep interior of Java. He prepared them to march on foot for hundreds of miles through brutal, unforgiving wilderness, not to negotiate a better trade deal, but to drag the greatest corporate superpower on earth out of its fortress and destroy it in the mud. Sultan Agung did not just send an army. He engineered a masterpiece of logistical brutality. To feed his massive forces across the unforgiving Javanese wilderness, he secretly constructed colossal rice granaries along the route months in advance. When his warriors finally reached the towering, heavily armed walls of Batavia, they did not blindly charge the cannons. They executed a terrifying war of absolute attrition. They utilized scorched earth tactics, burning the surrounding lands to starve the Dutch. When the stone walls proved too thick to breach, Sultan Agung's men simply dammed the Siliwang River. They cut off the city's fresh water supply, deliberately turning it into a stagnant swamp. This brilliant, ruthless tactic triggered a devastating disease outbreak that swept through the impenetrable fortress, eventually killing the Dutch Governor-General himself. Most leaders who mount a failed first campaign and sustain significant losses reduce their ambitions in the second attempt, negotiating from a position of demonstrated sincerity towards something short of the original goal. Sultan Agung launched a second campaign years later, and he did not reduce his objective. He expanded his preparations: more men, more granaries, more careful coordination of the supply lines that had partially failed the first time and returned with the same demand: complete removal of the foreign monopoly. He was not willing to be bought off by a partial victory, the same way he was not willing to be bought off by accommodation before the first campaign. The objective had been set before the first soldier marched, and it remained unchanged regardless of the cost of reaching it. The siege ultimately failed to destroy the VOC, but this outcome requires careful interpretation rather than simple acceptance as the verdict on Sultan Agung's choice. The VOC survived at Batavia, but it survived severely damaged, haunted by disease for years, and unable to fully consolidate its control of the Javanese interior for decades afterward. The other kings who accommodated found themselves steadily absorbed, their lands eventually administered directly by the VOC, with their cooperation no longer needed or compensated. Sultan Agung's Mataram, by contrast, remained a genuinely sovereign power within Java for generations beyond his own reign, precisely because he had established, at the cost of enormous sacrifice, that the price of absorbing it was higher than the VOC wanted to pay. His refusal to negotiate did not win him the war he was fighting. It established a boundary that every subsequent negotiation had to acknowledge, because the cost of ignoring it had already been demonstrated in blood. This is the part most people miss when they look only at the final military outcome. A defiance that extracts a real cost from the aggressor is not a failure, even when it falls short of total victory. It is the beginning of the terms on which all future interactions will be conducted. Sultan Agung did not care how much blood, time, or treasure it cost. He was willing to burn the earth, choke the rivers, and wage unrelenting warfare to prove one undeniable point. His empire would rather bleed out in the mud than live peacefully on its knees under a corporate monopoly. Now, look at your pathetic, compromised reality. You face a slightly saturated market, and you immediately give up. You see a massive corporation dominating your industry, and instead of finding a way to disrupt their dominance, you submit a job application to become their employee. You are terrified of the agonizing struggle required to build your own fortress, so you happily pay rent to live in someone else's. You have accepted the mentality of a vassal. You think that because a giant exists, you are not allowed to be a king. A real economic principle is worth understanding here, because the incumbents of any market use it to discourage competition, and because understanding its limits is the beginning of knowing where to attack. Researchers studying market disruption across industries have documented a consistent pattern. Successful challengers to dominant incumbents almost never win by competing directly at the incumbent's core strength. They win by identifying a segment the incumbent is structurally reluctant to serve, building a position of genuine dominance in that segment, and expanding from that position into adjacent territory only after the beachhead is secure. The incumbent's size, which is its primary advantage in a direct confrontation, becomes a disadvantage in the narrow segment because the overhead and complexity required to maintain a large organization makes it expensive and slow to operate at the smaller scale of a niche. Sultan Agung did not try to outbuild the VOC's fortress. He identified the fortress's dependency on a river and cut it off. You do not defeat the giant at its strongest point. You find the river it cannot survive without, and remove the river from the equation. The VOC looked invincible from the coast of Java in 1628. It looked invincible because it was powerful, not because it was unbeatable, and the difference between those two things is exactly what Sultan Agung spent the rest of his life proving. Every major company currently dominating its market was, at some point, the smaller, disadvantaged new entrant that the previous incumbent considered too insignificant to take seriously. The companies that currently look inevitable looked suicidal to compete against from the perspective of the day before they were obvious. What changed between those two moments was not a fundamental shift in the laws of commerce. It was a specific founder who refused to accept the incumbent's framing that the market was already settled. You must understand that the modern economic system is perfectly designed to domesticate you. A steady paycheck is the exact bribe they give you to forget your own dreams. They give you a minor title, a tiny annual bonus, and weekends off so you never fully realize the horrifying truth. You are spending the best, most energetic years of your one and only life building monumental wealth for men who do not even know your name. The domestication process is not sudden. It is not a dramatic moment where you consciously decide to abandon your ambitions. It is a series of small, individually rational compromises that collectively produce a life indistinguishable from the one you were most afraid of when you were young enough to still be afraid of something. You take the safe job because the timing isn't right yet. You delay the business idea because you need more capital first. You stay in the comfortable role for one more year because the raise is coming, and you'd be foolish to leave now. You postpone the sovereign life for a decade of individually reasonable decisions that, stacked end to end, add up to exactly the life a system optimized for your compliance was designed to produce. The brilliant thing about this trap, from the trap's perspective, is that at no single point does it require you to do anything that isn't defensible. Every step is logical. The path as a whole leads somewhere you never agreed to go. If you want true freedom, you must wage total war on your own complacency. Stop asking the market for permission to exist. Stop negotiating for a slightly bigger crumb off the master's table. You must be willing to endure the brutal, exhausting, lonely march through the wilderness of independence. You must be entirely willing to starve, sweat, and bleed to build something that belongs exclusively to you. Understand, too, what the war on complacency actually requires, because it is more specific than a declaration of principle. Sultan Agung did not simply refuse accommodation in his mind and continue living as a vassal while privately resenting the arrangement. He converted his refusal into a logistical campaign that took years to prepare. The granaries built in secret along the march route, the months of troop mobilization, the careful selection of a strategy that avoided the VOC's strongest defenses and attacked its hidden vulnerability. The sovereignty he was fighting for was not a feeling. It was a specific, operational reality he was engineering one decision at a time. Your version of this is likewise not a feeling. It is a series of concrete, often unglamorous decisions about where you spend your time, what you build, what you stop building for someone else, and what you are willing to tolerate for how long in the wilderness before the fortress you are constructing becomes undeniable. The VOC's greatest weapon was not its cannons. It was the fact that accommodation made rational sense, and that the kings who accommodated could construct a perfectly convincing argument for why they had made the sensible choice. Sultan Agung's greatest weapon was his refusal to be convinced by that argument, even when the argument was correct. The VOC was stronger. The odds were against him. The reasonable thing was to negotiate. He looked at all of that and decided that reasonable terms were the wrong measurement for a question about sovereignty, and acted accordingly, at full cost, without apology. Burn your compromises. Break your dependence on the system. Demand absolute, uncompromising sovereignty over your time, your energy, and your legacy. The river is yours. Damn it.